Welcome to the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up for the week of 26 April 2020. It was the month that time forgot. Show news, 0 days in SOPHOS XG, tracking apps, drones dealing drugs in Florida, and our cats plotting against you at home, probably. All this and more on the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the countless ways our critical systems can be put in jeopardy. Ransomware attacks, misconfiguration, user error, and malicious threat actors, to name a few. As IT infrastructures continue to grow and diversify, how do you ensure stable security? Core Security, a HelpSystems company, provides an analytics-driven, layered approach to security with a portfolio that enables both proactive and reactive responses. With Core Security, you can reduce risk by limiting access, detect upcoming and active threats, test for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitor data for actionable insights. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/core security. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Hello, I'm Doug White, your host from Roger Williams University, and welcome to the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up Show. Let's wrap up all the show topics for this week. On Application Security Weekly number 105, Mike, Matt, and John had an interview with Avi Duglin, the founder and CEO of Bounce Security. Avi's a cool guy, and he was talking about threat modeling and DevSecOps. He also talked about how AppSec is kind of a map into security culture. Cool interview. Avi's always great, so you should check that one out. On Business Security Weekly number 171, Paul, Jason, and Matt had a news segment on I often don't mention the news segments because they all have news segments, but I wanted to mention it to you today. They had a news segment on missteps to avoid when you return to the office. So I definitely think you should check that out. All of us are getting ready to start thinking about going back to physical places of work at some point, we hope. They also had an interview with David Spark, who is the producer of the CISO series media channel, which is an interesting channel to check out. This is a really nice opportunity to hear what he has to say and see how they're doing that channel, especially if you're a CISO or somebody like that. On Enterprise Security Weekly number 181, Matt and Paul had an interview with general all-around famous guy Vim Remus, who is the CEO and principal at Wire Security. They were talking about how to build an enterprise security team and recruiting the right people to serve on that team. In the second segment, Gerald Buchelt, the CISO at LogMeIn, came on to talk about how the pandemic has resulted in an aggressive spike of malicious cyber attacks. So definitely, again, as we're all dealing with this, in terms of our users, it's a good time to start seeing what other people have to say about it. On the Security Weekly News number 29, Jason Wood talked about Agent Tesla and the fact that they've been using the same phishing campaign for over a year and just not bothering to update the campaign because, hey, if it keeps working, why not? And so that was kind of an interesting segment about that. I hadn't really thought about, do they update these things? And as we see the malware industry turn into a malware as a business model, I guess they'll need to release patches. I don't know. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 26, Jeff, Matt, Josh, and Scott interviewed the blind hacker, Joe Brinkley. He's the director of offensive security at Active Cyber. They were talking about cyber and disabilities. Very cool show. I always admire people who have disabilities who are able to work through those to achieve their goals. I think it's just amazing to see somebody be able to do that. And Joe is certainly a great example of somebody who just says, hey, I can do anything I want. and does it very well. They did both segments on this. So it was a great show to check out if you have never talked with Joe or had a chance to hear him. And finally, on Paul Security Weekly, number 649 last night, the all-remote crew, except for Paul, had a tech segment with Sumit Thakur. He was the Chief Product Officer at Qualys. And they were talking about defensive strategies, and the tech segment was about defensive strategies in Qualys VMDR. So a good opportunity to check that out. They had an interview with Jeremy Miller, who is a retired Green Beret, like from like multiple wars. And also in that segment, the CEO, or Jeremy is the CEO of Lionfish Cybersecurity. And they also had Philip Niedermayer, who was in the segment as well. And they were talking about the use of mission set tactics from special forces, applying those to today's cyber warfare. So if you have interest in cyber warfare or the state of affairs in that realm, which is a pretty big realm these days, this was a really interesting segment. Philip is the CEO at National Cyber Group, so I thought that was a really fun segment to do that. I still, even today, I've got my empty martini glass here from last night because I forgot to take it back to the house when the show was over because I had drained it a couple of times. I made a Vesper martini with Grey Goose Poiret and Brooklyn Gin. So hang in there, Brooklyn. This too shall pass. And but it's one of my favorite drinks. But if you have more than a couple of those, you may actually miss the news segment on Security Weekly. So be careful if you're playing around with the very dangerous Vesper martinis. My favorite thread of the week is going to be COVID scammers. I've kind of been going back and forth on COVID hacks and COVID scammers, and I know they're kind of overlap between those. But whether it's phishing or credential stuffing, it seems this is just not going away. I just can't tell you how many news stories there are every week involving phishing, and you're probably seeing them as well. Phishing and targeting of people, and this week in particular was targeting of the stimulus checks. If you're unawares because you live in some other part of the world, the United States government, in their efforts to offset the economic impact of the COVID-19 virus, they started mailing people who fit the criteria checks and or auto depositing those checks this week for $1,200 US to try to help with the rent or the utility bills or whatever during the pandemic crisis. Well, scammers went all in targeting them. This is certainly, I think, to all of us, no big surprise. But the point from me here is that you probably need to be focusing on getting intel to your users to help them avoid this nonsense. Pretty much it looks like from the news reports, everyone from the CEO on down is falling for various phishing and scams lately. We saw all kinds of news stories about credential stuffing attacks, about phishing attacks on CEOs in particular. There was a couple of stories on Security Weekly about that kind of targeting. But remember, your users are at home, and it's a lot more difficult to focus on that email link that you've warned them about when you're holding a 1-year-old with a diaper that's getting ready to detonate on your lap. I have been there, and your cat's trying to eat your eyes, and I have been there as well. So you got in fact, I remember trying to write C code with my daughter sitting on my lap going, "What's that smell?" And my cat looking at me from the table going, "I think I'm going to jump on your face now," because I had a cat like that. They would sit there and look at you, and then you're going, don't do that. And then the cat would like jump on you and just go crazy. It was a good cat, but everybody's already worried and stressed. So the level of vigilance that you need is really, really high. And of course, the COVID scammers know that. They're taking advantage of that like crazy. I mean, I know you have an eye-eating pet too, probably, but try and get some guidance out there for all your users as you can. And now I want to sum up all the top news from the shows this week, the network that never sleeps. Well, we did sleep, but we're still on the air. In the category of golden oldies, brute force RDP attacks are on the rise. I saw this and went, well, at first I went, are you serious? But then I started thinking about it and I was like, that actually makes a lot of sense. According to this report, a typical average day in the United States saw about 200,000 attacks of the RDP brute forcing variety. But on the 10th of March, the number went to around 800,000 attacks that day. And by the 7th of April, it was about 1.4 million attacks per day. So this huge increase, so 7 times increase. There were similar patterns of this in Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and Russia being reported. Notably missing from the list was China. Enough said. My take is, of course, that as a lot of people went home, a lot of immediate things had to happen so that people could still connect, that they could get to the things that were left behind in their offices. They're getting used to working from their kitchen table with an eye-eating cat sitting nearby, and that's a whole thing. And then before you could develop sound policies and practice and training and so forth for VPN for all these new users, maybe you already had all those things, but a lot of people didn't. So it made sense that people would start to take advantage of that. So be sure you've got all your people on VPNs and multi-factor authentication. But again, that was hard to do after the fact. Sophos released an emergency security update on Saturday for a 0-day in its XG Enterprise Firewall product. A SQL injection vulnerability, or SQL. Different people say, I always said SQL, and then people started saying, oh, people say SQL. I always said SQL, but an SQL injection vulnerability allowed access to exposed XG devices through the UI on the device. The malware used to access the devices was named Asnarok by Sophos. So they actually named the malware, apparently. So if you're running XG firewalls, they did put out a patch, and you want to get that in place. Sophos did say there was no evidence that this was used to access any other device or as a launching point for attacks on the network. So it was primarily just getting into the firewalls themselves. At the same time, the SALT community became aware of a CVSS-related, it was rated 10 vulnerability in the SALT master piece of the software last week. Warnings about this popped up all over the place early in the week. And if you don't know, SALT is an open source tool from SaltStack, which is used to manage servers and devices using agents that are put on those devices. The SALT master, which is where the vulnerability was found, is the collection point for those agents. So that's a very big machine that has a lot of data and intel on it. These were 2 CVEs that came out, 2020 11.651 and 11.652, that were both published by F-Secure. SaltStack did release version 3000.2, which contains a patch for that. So be sure and patch up if you haven't already. To me, one of the big news stories this week that I think is affecting a lot of people, a lot of companies, Google, Apple, and Microsoft and other big tech companies, as well as governments, private industry, et cetera, are all scrambling to get a COVID-19 tracking app out for monitoring infections and outbreaks. There was a lot of stories about this from different angles this week. In this particular study that I put on the wiki, 3 out of 5 Americans in this study said they were either unable to or unwilling to use such an app. So now 1 in 6 Americans, so roughly 1 in 6 Americans don't actually have a smartphone. So that means they either don't have a phone or they have, like a flip phone or a Razor or, a Motorola Razor or something like that. With 53% of Americans who are 65 and older do not have a device capable of even running such a thing. Now, around 50% of people that have a phone that's capable of running it, so this was all the other age groups, said they would not use it despite all the claims of anonymity by the apps. Now, if you don't know about these apps, the Google and Apple app is a Bluetooth-enabled application that basically exchanges random numbers between phones when they come into contact with each other via Bluetooth. And the apps then track everyone that's come into contact with that and sends out a big notification to all those numbers, or however they're identifying the phones, if that person flags themselves as being infected. So then you would get a notification that somebody near that you had come into contact with was infected, and I guess you could go get tested if that was even possible. I'm guessing the lack of trust of all the big techs is just not helping the situation. They did do some discussions with that with the people that were in the poll. In India, the Arogya Setu app was downloaded 75 million times after it was released. But if you take India's population of 1.3 billion into account, that's about 6% of the population. Trace Together, which is another app that was being used in Singapore, was downloaded by about 20% of the population of Singapore in a couple of days. And around 8% of Australians have downloaded the government-sponsored app COVID Safe since last Sunday. There is a lot of discussion going on about this stuff in various companies who are trying to go back to work, schools who are trying to talk about how to bring students back in the fall, and others who are just talking about privacy use. I do a private video with students once a week or so called Not on the Exam. And I was doing one yesterday about this very thing, talking about privacy and how you felt about being tracked. And of course, tracking is a really poor name for these apps since they don't actually, supposedly, and I don't want to get into a whole debate, but the apps I was looking at did not track you. So they were not tracking where you were. They were just tracking other devices that you had come into contact with. And supposedly it was all anonymous and so on and so forth. So as we see people trying to get back to reopening their companies and organizations and schools and states and cities and towns and whatever over the summer, I think there's going to be a lot of talk about how do we know who's got this and should you be warned and how do you get tested and all that kind of stuff. So probably more to come on that. There was some good news from some of the chaos, in my opinion, good news. UPS and CVS, which is a drugstore company, if you're not familiar with it, are apparently now licensed to fly drones in the state of Florida, which has some of the largest retirement communities in the United States. And of course, retired individuals, people over certain ages, are the most at risk from COVID-19. Various companies have been talking about using drones for delivery for a while, but CVS said their new drone delivery service will start providing safe and efficient deliveries of medicine to the large retirement community called The Villages in Central Florida. UPS and others have received government approval to run a drone airline, which would allow them to fly drones beyond visual line of sight at day and at night. Currently, if you're a drone operator in the United States, you have to get an FCC license, or sorry, not FCC, an FAA license, so the Federal Aviation Administration license, and they restrict you to operating them line of sight in the daytime. But this is now considered a drone airline, and UPS said they completed medical deliveries in North Carolina already. So my opinion, soon the sky is going to be full of drones and prescription meds. Sounds like a Philip K. Dick novel in real life. I'm sure he would have been interested in such things. COVID-19 made being back a new focus on digital identity. ForgeRock closed funding with $93.5 million this week, and governments are all frantically looking for digital identity solutions as everything from unemployment to payments and registration to voting is being demanded remotely. If the unemployment office is closed and your company shuts down today, what exactly are you supposed to do? We already saw that these ancient systems in the unemployment office and welfare office in New Jersey were begging for COBOL programmers to come in to try to help them revise code from the 70s that was trying to deal with the massively increased demand for unemployment checks, unemployment insurance, all kinds of stuff. So I really doubt there's a good system in place to start to fill this need for digital identity if it's all these ancient systems. So things like RFID badges that you probably use at work now, swipe cards, which some people are still using, and so forth, are all being used, but they don't really validate you. It's just a card. Anyone could be using it. So there's a lot of interest in some kind of way to, actually identify the individual. IDEX Biometrics in Norway is trying to take the biometrics out of the cloud. It uses a fingerprint. that's stored on the local card, and then I guess it uses certificates to communicate somewhere so that people can validate the individual. Of course, that just means that you have a thumb. We probably shouldn't get into, people carrying, I've talked for years about people carrying strings of thumbs around their neck to use on the different identity cards they have. Famous scene, speaking of eyes, we were talking about earlier, Blade Runner has a famous scene where they're pulling eyes out of the bin, which always made me think about, and there's several movies where people have used, eyeballs and stuff on biometric readers. The real debate, of course, in this article is about cloud versus local housing of your critical information. It's definitely worth a read if your company is thinking about some of this stuff. Those drones that are bringing that oxy to your house are probably going to want some kind of solid ID to prove that you are who you say you are before they give up the goods, right? I mean, it seems that way to me. And finally, I just couldn't resist this story. I talked about it on Tuesday, but I can't resist it. Microsoft has decided that Word will flag 2 periods at the end of a sentence as a typo. The Atlantic and several other news sources picked up on this week, and I was going to add my 2, get it, shillings to the fight. I don't really care about the whole thing personally. Science, in this Atlantic article I put up, showed that 2 spaces apparently makes reading easier. I guess throughout known history, 2 spaces at the end of the sentence was mandatory, or at least that's what Sister Mary Margaret told me when I was learning typing, and she's going to hit you with her cane if you don't follow suit. I don't really know how the 2 spaces at the end of the sentence got started. It was probably somebody in the 1920s with a space bar fetish, or maybe it was like a guy with an extra thumb in, like 1919 or whatever, old 3-thumb man. He really liked to lay on the space bar. I don't know. But even as I continually type 2 spaces automatically as Pavlov's best dog, I don't really care. 2 spaces. There's 2 spaces on that note. But Microsoft has ruled, and that's the way it is. So 1 space from here on out, 2 spaces again on my notes. And that is the news wrap-up for the week of 26 April 2020 in the time of plague in the month that wasn't. Don't drink bleach or inject yourself with disinfectant or any of that stuff. Look, and wear a mask. My mother is old, and I would really like to keep her around a little bit longer. That's why you're wearing the mask, not to protect you. I'm Doug White from the RD Online Cybersecurity Program at Roger Williams University. See you next week on the network that never shuts down, Security Weekly. Read the science and stay safe.